Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm excellent. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV and Meaning of Life TV. You're Michelle Goldberg, author of a few books,
Yeah,
right? The
most
means of You want me to recite them as if I'm intimately familiar with your career?
you could do that, or I could do that.
Well, you're probably more intimately familiar. I'll
Okay.
turn it over to you then.
So my first book was called Kingdom Coming: The Rise of Christian Nationalism. It was about religious fundamentalism in American politics. I wrote a book about women's rights internationally called The Means of Reproduction: Sex Out, Sex Power, and the Future of the World. And then, in what I think on the surface seems like a major detour, I wrote this book about Indra Devi called The Goddess Pose: The Audacious Life of Indra Devi, the woman who helped bring yoga to the West.
Right. And I wish I could hold up the book itself, but since I've been reading the Kindle version, I'm going to have to hold up my smartphone. The cover looks exactly like that. I think. Very nice looking cover. Published with the highly prestigious publisher Knopf. It's being very well received and rightly so. It's really interesting. Very well written, predictably, also deeply researched, and it also happens to be about something that fascinates me, even though I know nothing about yoga and have never done it. But the whole backdrop of the emergence of this thing, this bringing of yoga to the West and to America, fascinated me. And I want to talk. Were you about to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, to me, it's like one of the most kind of underreported of cultural phenomenon, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's this huge phenomenon. I mean, as huge as, so many other sort of, I think according to Yoga Journal figures, something like 9% of American adults do yoga, right? That's like more than certainly participate in, soccer or,
Mm-hmm.
I don't, could be more than play basketball, if not watch basketball, probably is. I mean, it's just a huge, huge, huge cultural phenomenon that it gets covered within its own media, right?
Mm-hmm.
But its own media is rife with all sorts of myths and, um,
Yeah.
there's been very little sort of sympathetic but skeptical analysis of this phenomenon.
Right. And let me tell you what my vague conception of yoga had been before I read your book. First of all, I thought of it as basically just exercise, kind of like aerobics. I knew that sometimes people stood still for periods of time and did these poses, but I thought of it as fundamentally this physical exercise. I knew it had kind of a spiritual aura and was related to health foods and stuff and all of that. But I thought that by and large, it had kind of shed the authentic spiritual kind of clothing that it had in India long, long ago, and had ceased to be in any meaningful sense a spiritual enterprise. I learned from your book the story is actually more complicated than that in a couple of senses. I mean, at one point you say there was never any pure, unchanging tradition to corrupt in the first place, right? So the whole idea that there was this Platonic form of highly spiritual yoga ever is kind of misleading, right?
I think it's particularly if you're thinking about the sort of physical practice of yoga, what's called hatha yoga. Until, like what you just said, that when you think of yoga, you think of this, kind of quasi aerobics type
Mm-hmm.
of system. That, 100 years ago, that would have been sort of unintelligible, right? When you said yoga, nobody thought of a system of poses. Nobody thought of even really physical practices. They when they thought either of meditation or kind of a system of philosophy, and the physical part of it emerged, in the context of Indian nationalism, right? When you basically had this global craze for kind of quote unquote physical culture at the beginning of the 20th century, and you had all of these, physical culture was very important to the Indian nationalists, in part because the British had justified their domination of India, partly on the grounds that Indians are kind of weak and, effeminate and can't quite take care of themselves. And so the Indian nationalists were very, very concerned with kind of strength in every sense.
And some of this, they drew on Western tradition for some of this, right? At one point, the influence was kind of flowing west to east, at least along this particular dimension, right?
Right. So you had, a lot of Indians who were very, very interested in bodybuilding, and there was a sort of bodybuilding superstar named Sandow, who, when he went to India, was just kind of rapturously received But at a certain point, just as the Indian nationalists were looking for their own indigenous version of things, I guess the most famous version is kind of spinning cotton, right? They also started looking for their own indigenous version of physical culture. And there was a number of innovators who sort of said, well, we have our own indigenous version of physical culture called yoga. Mm-hmm. And they took some things that had previously been understood to be yoga, elements that came from these sort of medieval hatha practices of renunciates, but also warriors and mendicants and all sorts of figures. And they combined it with some Indian practices, but that had never really come under the rubric of yoga, right? That had been things that traditionally Indian wrestlers did to get ready for their matches. And also with things that came from British Army calisthenics and a Scandinavian system of gymnastics. Mm-hmm. And this sort of mashup is where yoga as we know it today comes from.
Right. And it's a fascinating story. The woman herself, who was actually born as Eugenia Peterson or something, she was Russian. She's a fascinating story for sure. Now, before we back up and kind of tell it from the beginning, I'd like to get a slightly clearer view in my own mind of what yoga is now and what it is to you, because you're a practitioner. At one point you write, you talk about how in the course of researching the book, kind of doubts about the authenticity of the tradition arise, but then you write, yet yoga remains as important to me as ever. My yoga classes even helped me deal with the doubts about yoga that occasionally emerged while I was writing this book. Now, for somebody who really doesn't know much at all about yoga, explain how yoga would help you deal with any kinds of doubts. Like, how does that work?
I guess probably the same way. I don't think it's that different than how people find, people kind of find psychological solace in jogging, mm-hmm. or all sorts of practices. I mean, basically, as I wrote in the book, I started doing yoga in India and have, when I was in my 20s, and have long loved it and long been kind of intensely skeptical of everything that I've ever heard from my teachers. But the reason I stuck with it all these years is because it works, right? It makes you feel, calm and energized and stable and, measurably less neurotic, which is still somewhat neurotic in my case, but is like an intensely therapeutic. It's calming and it's good for you, and
right.
So.
Well, is it calming just the way exercise is? Jogging is the example you brought up, or is it calming more the way What's that?
I don't know if it has any sort of special magic powers that go beyond exercise, except in this regard. Well, I would say in two different regards. One, there's just deep breathing, right? So deep breathing itself has certain sort of physiological effects that are pretty well documented. And then I also think that there's instructions that are given in modern yoga classes that sort of mirror what you would do in cognitive therapy, mm-hmm. sort of to try to pay attention to how when you get into like a difficult position, your brain goes spinning off into like, well, I can't do this, and here's the other things I can't do, and here are the ways that my life is a failure. And I think if you're doing it all the time and you have a good teacher, you become very attuned to the way your mind works when you're in a position that makes you uncomfortable. And if you can like learn to get some distance from that, which again, I think is not that different than what you would do in cognitive therapy. So to me, it has this sort of 3-in-1 thing, right? It has the physical aerobic side. It has deep breathing, which is, kind of constituent part of a lot of meditative practices. And then it has this sort of part that helps you, I think, maybe better understand the kind of familiar grooves of your mind.
Now, that last part sounds to me like it has a fair amount in common with modern mindfulness meditation.
Well, modern mindfulness meditation and modern yoga are, both sort of mashups of ancient Eastern practices seen through the lens of sort of modern Western psychotherapeutics.
Right. But, I mean, the reason I ask is because in reading your book, I became aware of how, as you suggested earlier, 100 years ago, at one point, yoga was deeply intertwined with mystical philosophy and with what sounds often in your book almost exactly like Buddhist philosophy. I mean, there's an emphasis on non-attachment, the dissolution of the ego, the idea that the problems you're having lie in the thoughts you're having, not in inherent properties of the actual world, and so some distance from the thoughts or even vanquishing of the thought. Well, I mean, you know, there are different parts of Buddhism and different strands, and what I just said doesn't apply to all of them.
Right, and obviously, and, you know, like Hinduism and Buddhism overlap in certain ways, don't overlap in other ways. There's, you know, and also a lot of popular mindfulness. Some of it emerges from the Buddhist traditions, but some of it also emerges from transcendental meditation, which is, you know, sort of a Hindu tradition, right? There's lots of ways in which the metaphysics of these are overlapping, but then there's also lots of ways in which they are sort of so far divorced from their religious origins, right? Because neither Buddhism nor Hinduism or, you know, yogic philosophy is not really a method for learning to be more efficacious in the world, right? It's a kind of pessimistic.
Not originally, no.
Right, it's a very pessimistic philosophy about how to kind of completely destroy your attachment to reality.
Well, people argue over whether the upshot is ultimately pessimistic, but leaving that aside, I guess in a way, a bottom line question I have for you is, do you consider your yoga practice spiritual?
Not really. It's hard for me to say. I mean, I'm still, you know, I was an atheist going into this, and I still am. And, you know, I mean, you can be an atheist Buddhist. It's one of the reasons why I think, you know, these practices appeal to sort of people who are both secular but also, you know, kind of unsettled. You know, I mean, Sam Harris, I think, has a very strong meditation practice that he's written about. And so I guess in as much as, I guess maybe a better way to answer it would be that it depends on what you mean as spiritual. I don't really know how to disentangle the spiritual from the sort of psychological, you know, so I consider it, like I've said before, like very therapeutic mentally and psychologically. And I think other people might attach the word spiritual to some of that, but I guess I sort of reject all the metaphysics.
Okay. So let's start.
Before I say reject all the metaphysics, or I see the metaphysics, at least in as much as they're meaningful to me, it's as sort of metaphors for things that are actually physiological.
Okay, so let's do back up and kind of do a whirlwind tour of the story you tell. So the backdrop, culturally, we're going back to the, you know, beginning of the 20th century, I guess, or even earlier in some cases. And by the end of the 19th century, you have this kind of crisis of faith, first of all, right? Where with Darwinism and everything, people are starting to doubt, you know, the Christian faith, for example, and yet they're spiritually hungry. In some ways, that's still with us, right? I mean, that part is kind of familiar, right?
Right. I mean, well, yeah, especially right now when you have this sort of, you know, the kind of rise of the unaffiliated. You know, when you look at the Pew polls, you know, fewer and fewer people are associating themselves with traditional religions, and yet people, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not believers. They're just sort of, a lot of them are searching. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, when we say God is dead, right? It sounds like it's been said so many times that it sounds like such a cliche, but it was so cataclysmic to have your whole conception of the way the world works rocked in that way.
Right.
And people felt like, you know, or those people who felt like their Christianity was no longer sustainable started thinking that they could find answers somewhere else, you know, and a lot of them looked to India.
Right. Now this, the woman at the center of the story, Eugenia, later Indra, she's a classic seeker in some sense of the word, right? I mean, she's kind of spiritually hungry in some sense of the word. I don't think she had been brought up in an especially religious way, as I recall. She was part of the Russian aristocracy.
Right, and her family were Russian Orthodox, but no, I don't think that they were, especially not her grandparents, but, you know, her mother was an actress, she was Bohemian, and so, yeah, they were Russian Orthodox, but I don't think that had been a huge part of her upbringing.
Mm-hmm. But she's looking for something, right? She's traveling the world, and there's a series of people she kind of starts following, or at least absorbs a lot from, right?
Well, right. So she's looking for something, and, you know, she also survived kind of a series of historical cataclysms. I mean, I think she probably would have been a searcher regardless, but I think that the circumstances that she lived for maybe gave a particular urgency to her questions about detachment and about.
Yeah, the Russian Revolution was kind of unsettling for members of the Russian aristocracy.
Yeah, exactly. So, right, and not just that. I mean, then she, like, part of the reason I was interested in her story is because it does live through so many kind of pivotal historical moments, right? So, the Russian Revolution, Weimar Germany, and then after she learns yoga, Shanghai during World War II, the Japanese occupation, where she's living basically as a sort of a stateless person, because at that point she's married to a Czech diplomat who, all of a sudden there's no more Czechoslovakia, right? So she kind of, I think the fact that she is like a stateless person, and that she needs to sort of make, part of the way she deals with that, I think, is to make a virtue of it, and to make kind of statelessness almost a spiritual precept as opposed to just a material condition, right? So she really wants to kind of float over the surface of the world and not be bound by history and not be bound by, the sort of like churn of events. And she sees yoga as a path to doing that.
Right. Now she gets involved early on with a movement known as Theosophy, which is one of the early reactions, in a way, to the crisis of faith we described. Right? It was like Westerners looking for something spiritual. They drew on some stuff from the East and so on. And what would you say? What's your thumbnail definition of what Theosophy was, and I guess maybe still is?
Well, yeah, I mean, it still exists, but I mean, I basically see it as the grandmother of every New Age. New Age practice, New Age religion, New Age sect. I mean, it was founded by this sort of another fantastic, flamboyant Russian woman, Madame Blavatsky, who was also a member of the Russian aristocracy, and who came to the United States, was a medium and an itinerant clairvoyant. And she, along with some other people, including a man named Henry Seal Olcott, they basically had the idea of finding the essential wisdom in every great religious tradition. The idea being that you could that there was going to be one fundamental truth that is at the heart of every different kind of wisdom tradition. If you could find that, you could find something that is really, is really true. That was the initial idea, although in time their emphasis and their focus shifted more and more east. So it became sort of like a Westernized Hinduism or Westernized Buddhism.
And one of the best known probably exemplars of that initial attempt you're describing is Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy, and Huxley is one of many interesting people who entered this story. I mean, her Indra Devi's path crosses with a lot of interesting people, as we'll see. Now, as far as Theosophy goes, there's a figure. A guy named Krishnamurti, a pretty well-known mystic,
right, yeah,
who later parted ways with Theosophy, but he was part of it for a while, and he was an important. He played a key role in her evolution, right?
Krishnamurti is such an interesting person because even though I said I am an atheist, I think that there is something almost sort of mystical in the fact that he didn't become a monster, but actually did become a great spiritual teacher, right? He was just sort of So the Theosophists eventually relocated to a compound in Adyar outside Chennai in southern India. And it's still there. It's this fantastic kind of religious fantasia with, a church and a synagogue and a mosque and temples and, Gurudwara, every sort, artifacts of every sort of religion. And one day, one of the theosophical leaders, who happened to have a passion for adolescent boys, saw this young man who was, it's kind of like scrawny, illiterate son of someone who worked on the grounds, and said, he's going to be a great savior of mankind. And they sort of anointed him, and he was given over to the Theosophists to be this great spiritual teacher. And so he was raised from childhood in the sort of theosophical hothouse. And then the irony is that when he gets to be in his 20s and starts giving talks, Westerners hear him as this voice of authentic India, when in fact he's been raised
by these Westerners who, with their kind of pseudo-Indian
Right, exactly. But they would have these things called the star camps, which I almost see as sort of like proto Decorous Burning Man type things, right? Where people like aristocrats and bohemians and artists and seekers from all over Europe and the United States would gather in these huge camps on the grounds of this palace in the Netherlands. And Krishnamurti would give talks, and there would be huge bonfires and music and, you know, all sorts of different events, and everybody would camp. And it was at one of these events that she both encountered Krishnamurti and first learned how to meditate. And really, she'd had this dream of going to India since she was a teenager.
Right.
In yoga in India in kind of Silver Age Russia, but then it was really getting involved with theosophy that gave her a path to actually do that.
Right. And this was, so really she, and she was quite taken by this experience, I gather, this meditative experience, before she really became seriously engrossed in yoga per se. It was meditation. In your view, I mean, Krishnamurti, it always seems amazing to me. It's kind of like the Dalai Lama. You just pick somebody when they're young. I mean, the Dalai Lama, at least they give rigorous tests to these 4-year-olds or whatever, so maybe there's some basis for, maybe there's a little bit of talent scouting going on, but it seems kind of amazing to me that somebody picks a poverty-stricken kid off the streets and he turns out to be a great teacher. Is your assessment of Krishnamurti that he really was a person of kind of deep insight and wisdom and...
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, part of the extent of his deep wisdom and insight is that he ultimately rejects theosophy. I mean, not that I see theosophy as a contemptible tradition, but just he was kind of given this empire and, you know, with riches and groupies and institutions, and he turns his back on it and says that this is all, you know, kind of decadent and it's facade and this isn't the path of truth. And, you know, instead kind of develop this very spare and sort of austere minimalist philosophy. So it's not that I necessarily that philosophy resonates with me so much. It's just that, you know, given kind of all of that power and all of those riches, that he doesn't take advantage. There's something, you know, to me deeply admirable about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Indra Devi, whom I think I mistakenly called Indra Devi at one point.
Well, you know, I've actually been going back and forth about how I should refer to her because, as you know, some people who speak Sanskrit have written to me to point out, you know, the Indian term, like Sanskrit, you would say Devi, right? Devi means goddess. And the tricky thing is that she, you know, she wasn't Indian. She changed her name to Indra Devi later in her life, and that was, you know, almost universally how she was known. It was how people around her pronounced it. And so I keep finding myself, on the one hand, saying Indra Devi, on the other, sometimes I say Indra Devi, though, you know, because that's
well, I said none of the above, so that doesn't vindicate me. But but as long as we're on here, I assume the title of the book, The Goddess Pose, is a little bit of a double entendre. I mean, on the one hand, it is an actual pose in yoga,
right,
called the Goddess Pose. But is this a little bit of a comment on her?
Yes and no. I mean, I hope that nobody. I think that people maybe take it as being harsher than I initially intended. I mean, to me,
I think it's pretty sympathetic on balance. The book itself.
I just mean the title.
The title, yeah.
Like, to me, it was on the one hand. Well, it was almost like kind of a triple entendre, right? This is an actual pose. The name that she took means goddess, you know, and I meant it to sort of refer to the fact that this has become such a sort of integral part of the lives of modern cosmopolitan women, right? Part of this story is about how yoga became such an adjunct to modern female life. You know, and yes, it's also about this woman who reinvents herself over and over again as sort of a spiritual exemplar. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so after she crosses paths with Krishnamurti, she then has a couple of really important kind of yoga per se teachers. And just to set the backdrop of this a little more, I was interested in your discussion of Vivekananda. So he is, maybe as much as anyone, he was responsible for bringing the West and America in touch with Eastern philosophy and mysticism. In 1893, at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, which was a really important thing, very idealistic thing. Can't all the faiths get along? Aren't they all saying largely the same thing, and so on?
It's also, like I said, that was a very similar idea to Theosophy, and Theosophists were heavily involved in the Parliament of World Religions.
Right. And he stole the show, kind of. Vivekananda, an Indian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he burst on the scene, and he had kind of a dim view of Hatha Yoga, which is the kind most familiar to people, the kind that's about physical poses, right? Because he thought that the tradition is much richer than that.
Well, it's not even that he thought the tradition is much richer than that. He thought that was kind of a completely unimportant part. That Hatha Yoga had been in serious disrepute. It had been kind of a marginal part of the yogic tradition that at that point was mostly practiced by sort of sideshow beggars. And, so he kind of just dismisses it outright. He says, there's a line or two about it in his book, and it's just like, we won't be spending very much time on it because it's very difficult and doesn't give much enlightenment. Mm-hmm. So part of what's tricky when you talk about kind of yoga's history, and particularly yoga's history in the West, is that it's this incredibly labial word that means so many different things. And so people can get a sense that there's continuity when there's really not, because we're talking about people doing entirely different things under the name of yoga, right? So he wrote this book called Raja Yoga. It was a bestseller, but it was about philosophy and meditation. It had nothing to do with, downward facing dog, or, the warrior poses, or any of the things that we would think of as being synonymous with yoga right now.
Which Hatha Yoga, he dismissed as, I think, quote, physical, not spiritual, right?
Right. Well, and the thing is, he actually did care quite a bit about physical fitness, and he because he was an Indian nationalist and thought that people needed to get strong, he encouraged people to eat beef, because he thought that would help sort of bulk them up and give them more vitality for the struggle. But Hatha Yoga he didn't think was important.
Yeah. So at one point, yoga did mean meditation as much as it meant anything else, and not that long ago.
I shouldn't say as much. I mean, that's what it meant.
Uh-huh.
Like if you look at, and I have the worst time pronouncing his name, but the Romanian religion scholar, Mircea Eliade.
Yeah.
His definition of yoga was that it's basically any concentration or meditative technique.
Okay. So then the star of our show has a series of teachers, falls in and out of love, very, she's what's the term for her? She's not a pillar of stability, I would say, which makes her interesting.
She's sort of a flighty, adventurous ingenue, right?
Theatrical a little bit. Her
right.
mother, she was in the theater.
She's an actress. So she flees the revolution. She becomes a cabaret performer in Weimar, Berlin. She travels around with this troupe, has this passionate affair that ends in tears, becomes involved in theosophy, follows the theosophists to India, sort of hangs around. The theosophists were intertwined with the Indian nationalist movement in very interesting ways. So she's kind of on the edges of the Indian nationalist movement. Mm-hmm. And she has this flirtation with Nehru. She acts in early silent Hindi cinema. She had this sort of immense charisma that people were always like taking her in or inviting her places or wanting to take care of her. So she didn't have money, but she led a sort of aristocratic life because she was constantly being she was kind of constantly floating around as a guest of people who did have money, and so she takes that about as far as it can go before she finally did need some sort of stability, and that's when she marries this Czech diplomat, and actually got quite depressed. I mean, she explains it in spiritual terms, and this is one of the tricky things in the book is that because I don't think in those terms. What she describes as this sort of spiritual malaise read to me like depression, and it read to me like that she had just sort of was suffering kind of what like the women in the feminine mystique suffered, it's like, is being a society wife really all there is?
Although she was never settling for that role in a way. I mean, she was always kind of out there, and now she starts teaching meditation while in, of all places, Shanghai, right? Is that her first?
So basically, what happens is, up to this point, she still hasn't really learned yoga, particularly, or at least.
Oh, I meant to say yoga, but yeah, go ahead.
Right. So finally, her husband was transferred to Shanghai. They're back in Europe, and she's kind of getting ready to say goodbye to India. And she's invited to a wedding at the Mysore Palace, which is this sort of, amazing fantasia of a palace, and the Maharaja of Mysore is this very progressive, multi-talented man with this huge wide range of interests, and one of those interests was physical culture and modern yoga. And he had a yogi in residence named Krishnamurti, who had been part of this ferment, this taking of ancient, hatha practices and mixing them with elements of, calisthenics and modern physical fitness techniques. Mm-hmm. And he, in residence at the Mysore Palace, was developing a lot of the systems that we think of today as being synonymous with yoga. So she ends up there. She wants to study with him. She, goes to try to become his pupil. He rejects her outright. He doesn't want to teach a Westerner or a woman. She goes over his head to the Maharaja, who's her friend. The Maharaja basically makes him take her on as a teacher. And eventually, he develops a sort of grudging and then genuine respect for her when he sees that she's serious. So she studies with him for months. He teaches her a different system than he teaches some of his younger students who went on to become very, very famous and taught a much more kind of demanding and aerobic style. She at this point is, a woman kind of approaching middle age. And so the style he taught her is gentler. Mm-hmm. But then she joins her husband in Shanghai, where she opens her first yoga studio and becomes a teacher to expat society in wartime China.
Mm-hmm. And then she eventually starts teaching in America, wisely sets up practice on Sunset Boulevard.
Right.
And winds up teaching...
First yoga teacher in Hollywood.
Right. And she's teaching Gloria Swanson, Greta Garbo, right? And she enters at the elite level. She's teaching the stars, and then she starts writing books, and by now we're into the 50s, and we are at the beginnings of the modern yoga craze, right? She writes a best-selling book about it.
I think people kind of think that it started in the U.S. in the 60s, but it really didn't. I mean, she wrote this book, in the 50s. Gloria Swanson was the one who gave it its name, Forever Young, Forever Healthy. And it's this sort of very common sense, book sort of geared to Eisenhower's America. Here's a book, techniques to manage stress. It doesn't require you to believe in any weird religious doctrines, but, you can kind of follow these simple steps to have better sleep, a better complexion, a happier disposition, to do better at your job, to be a better spouse. There's like a little bit of a sort of strange sort of feminism woven in there. But, she was very good at at kind of capturing the zeitgeist, right? So she pitches things, I think, she was able to pitch things pretty precisely to her audience and to make it seem domesticated and not weird or threatening.
And her feminist message was one that might today be considered ironic or paradoxical. I mean, she's definitely encouraging women to get out there and, lean in. But she's saying that the way you got to do it is look beautiful, look great. Right? I mean... Right,
and so she could be sort of like harsh in that she would say, stand before a mirror and figure out what you don't like about yourself and how to change what you did to make it that way.
Kind of the opposite of what we say today.
But I guess the difference is that, right, this is the 50s. This is a time when literature directed at women is incredibly reactionary. So what she's also saying is that part of the reason women are suffering is because they don't have their equality. And, she's saying that marriages are suffering because that if women are frigid, it's the fault of men who don't know how to perform. She believes passionately in independence, right? She believes passionately in kind of self-expression. And so, it's kind of proto-feminism, but it's certainly, if you read The Feminine Mystique and you read about kind of how terrible pop culture messages directed at women at that time were, compared to that, it's kind of revelatory.
This is progress, yes. So, now she does, she continues to hang on to what I see as some kind of Buddhist themes, or at least Eastern themes. One of them is non-attachment, right? Now,
right, but it's a weird sort of non-attachment. And non-attachment, like that was sort of the central message of her teaching was, love and non-attachment, or love and detachment. And she believed that those two things could be combined. And I am less and less sure, at least as she practiced them.
Now, did she mean non-attachment as Buddhists might to kind of everything? Or did she mean specifically you should love people without undue attachment to them?
I think both. I mean, yeah, certainly you should love people without undue attachment to them, without making demands on each other that would in any way sort of stymie the full expression of your personality. But also that you should be unattached to like any specific place, any specific religion, any specific moment in history, that you should have a certain kind of equanimity to the shifts and changes, which, served her very well and I think is a pretty important lesson. What I'm more dubious about is the extent to which kind of non-attachment can just be used as a way to evade responsibility, and so I don't know if you can have love maybe you can have love without attachment. I don't know if you can have love without responsibility.
It's not even easy to have love without attachment, I think, but much less love without responsibility. But so this was like an explicit part of her teaching, and if so, I gather it's been kind of lost in yoga, right? I assume not. Tell me if I'm wrong. Do yoga teachers talk about non-attachment?
Yes, they do. They do. But again, I think it would be unintelligible to someone kind of steeped in classical yoga philosophy, right? It's not, they'll kind of say, classical yoga philosophy, we're talking about, often prescribing celibacy. It's a philosophy that was developed for wandering male renunciates. It wasn't kind of about how to let go of the stress of your day or,
right.
Not kind of get too upset because your husband does something that bothers you. It was about, again, obliterating the bonds that hold you to the earth and the, kind of obliterating your attachment to, obliterating kind of seeing through reality, understanding that all of reality was an illusion. And so you're kind of,
to the extent that something like that is still part of the tradition, I would say then you are moving in the direction of something that at least I would call spiritual. I mean, when I say spiritual, I don't mean supernatural.
Right, I think that that's true, but I think that if you go to most modern yoga classes, that's sort of not how it's coming across. It's much more, non-attached, and it's still useful, I think. And in certain ways it's more useful, right? Because actually, I don't think that most modern secular people with families and jobs truly want to obliterate their bonds with the material world. They want to kind of function a little bit better within it. And so the way that non-attachment gets interpreted in sort of modern yoga culture is useful, even though it would be completely foreign, I think, to people who kind of actually come out of that tradition in a sort of a deep sense, right? It's not so much about, but yeah, as she taught it, and as I think how it's come to pervade the culture, it's more about, again, letting go.
And I'm curious, is the non-attachment related to the teaching you talked about at the beginning of our conversation about, don't get too caught up in your thoughts and your anxieties and so on? Because, in Buddhism, that would be. Among the things you're not supposed to be attached to are your thoughts and your feelings. Have you heard any yoga teachers make that explicit
absolutely.
connection?
Yeah, that is very explicitly. And that, if you can gain some distance from your thoughts, that means you are not your thoughts.
Right.
And so, trying to kind of separate the real self. So yes, there is part of that maybe in kind of a very elementary form is, I think, a part of the teachings in most yoga classes.
Okay.
But I think that it can be interpreted as, it gets sort of filtered into, kind of don't let anybody make it, I'm like, it can become like an excuse to just run away from anything when it gets difficult.
And in any event, you do have the irony that, I mean, on the one hand, she's saying don't get attached to things. On the other hand, her best-selling book is called Forever Young, Forever Healthy. And, like,
right.
I mean, wait a second. You actually can't hang on to your youth. I'm sorry. You can't, you know.
Right. Of all the things that you have to be attached, of all the things
Right.
that you need to kind of cultivate detachment, you need to cultivate detachment about you can neither hang on to your youth or your health, right? So in as much as these practices were once, I mean, I think in Buddhism, very explicitly about contemplating the inevitability of your own death.
Right.
This is about, and I think this is in mindfulness too, it's more kind of how to let go of things that you can ultimately get them.
Right. Well, it's a really fascinating book. All right, now, are you? So your yoga practice remains more or less unchanged.
Well, yeah. I mean, when I started writing this book, I didn't have any children, and now I have two. So that more than anything else has, I can't go to yoga 5 days a week anymore.
Yeah.
More like 2 if I'm lucky. But that's what's changed. Certainly, I think I started the book for a bunch of reasons, but one of them was because, I'd been doing this thing since I was in my mid-20s and wanted to know what it was and where it came from and what of the things I was hearing in my class were bullshit and what actually, had some sort of grounding. Went through maybe a period of disillusionment when I realized how much of this is modern and kind of lacks, the authenticity, which I think is why people turn to yoga in the first place instead of just doing aerobics or Pilates. Mm-hmm. And then sort of made my peace with that and realized that, to me, it matters much more that it works than that it's old.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Anything else you want to say about the book? Have we missed whole dimensions of it?
Well, again, the thing that, we certainly didn't get to her role in the American invasion of Panama. But again, I think that, to me, the thing that was so much fun about writing it was that she is the sort of Zelig figure, right? And so it does become this sort of strange counter history of the 20th century, up to and including Latin American politics during the Reagan administration. And that was actually one of the most fun chapters to write, and partly because the people from then are still alive. So Colonel Roberto Diaz Herrera, Noriega's second in command, who she inspired to try to overthrow him, helped me a lot when I went down there. Oh. And, still talks about her as kind of the greatest teacher that he ever had.
She must have been charismatic in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I don't really believe in cities or, yogic powers, but if I did, I would say that her charisma was one.
And she lived to be what, 100, 102?
She died just before her 103rd birthday.
So there you go.
So it works. I mean, I think that one of the lessons of the book, it might not be like a testament to the ethics of the practice, but it's a testament to the efficacy of the practice.
Yeah. Well, it's a great book. Thanks. The Goddess Pose, and it's a fascinating story. And I hope you come back and talk when you write another book, if not sooner.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.